In a peat bog in northern Germany, scientists just pulled a complete skull out of the ground, and what they found inside it should not have been possible. A splinter of wood lodged deep inside the skull cavity, not fallen in, not washed in by water, driven in on purpose 10,500 years ago. Someone had taken this skull and forced it down onto a sharpened wooden post. And here is the part that has archaeologists genuinely disturbed. This was not the skull of an enemy. This was not a trophy of war. The people who did this were performing some kind of ritual we still do not understand. So here is the question that this entire video is going to answer. Why would Stone Age people, 10,000 years ago, mount skulls on stakes and stand them up at the edge of the water? What were they trying to do, and who or what were those skulls meant to face? Stay with me, because the answer is stranger than the trophy theory everyone assumes. This is one of the oldest and most unsettling discoveries in European archaeology, and it was confirmed just months ago. Let me take you to the place where it was found. The site is called Luchau, in a region of Germany known as Schleswig-Holstein. Today it is a quiet, waterlogged peat bog, but 10,500 years ago it was the shoreline of a shallow lake, and people lived here. These were not farmers. There were no farms anywhere on Earth yet. These were hunter-gatherers living at the very beginning of our modern climate, right after the last ice age finally released its grip on the planet. And the reason this find matters so much comes down to one rare condition: peat. Here is why that single word changes everything. Wood rots, bone scatters. In almost every Stone Age site on Earth, the wooden parts of a story vanish within a few years, and the archaeologist is left guessing. But peat is different. Peat has almost no oxygen, and without oxygen, the bacteria that destroy wood and flesh simply cannot survive. So this bog did something almost no other place can do. It froze a single moment in time and held it for 10,000 years, which means the team digging here was not looking at scattered fragments. They were looking at a scene preserved exactly as it was left, and the scene was a grave. But before we get to the skull, you need to understand what was sitting right next to it, because on its own, it is already a record breaker. The grave belonged to a single person, and that person had been burned on a funeral pyre. The bones that survived the fire were gathered up and laid carefully into a shallow pit on the lakeshore, the arm and leg bones placed at the bottom, the skull resting on top. This cremation is now the oldest known burial of its kind in all of northern Germany. There are only 2 others like it in this entire era across Europe, one in the Netherlands and one in Denmark. So already this is not an ordinary grave. This was a person who mattered, a person whose death demanded effort and ceremony. And then just in front of the grave, in what used to be the shallow water at the lake's edge, the archaeologists found the post. A thick wooden post driven deep into the lake bed, standing upright, facing the dead. At first nobody could be sure what it was for. A marker, maybe. A simple grave post. That is what the team assumed. They were wrong. And the proof was still waiting underground. In the summer of the most recent dig season, the team uncovered something they did not expect at all. A second skull. But this one was not human. It was the skull of an aurochs. Now, if that word is new to you, let me put it in your mind correctly. The aurochs was the wild ancestor of modern cattle, but it was nothing like the gentle cows you picture in a field. An aurochs was a monster of an animal. It stood taller than a man at the shoulder. Its horns swept forward like spears. It was one of the largest, most dangerous land animals a Stone Age hunter could ever face. And to these people, an animal like that was not just meat. It was power. It was spirit. It was something close to a god. This complete aurochs skull was lying in the ground directly in front of the human grave. And here is the detail that made the researchers stop. There were no cut marks on it, no signs that it had been butchered for food, no smashing, the way you break a skull open to get at the brain. The skull had been kept whole and treated with care, which raised an impossible question. Why was a giant wild bull's head lying perfectly intact beside a human cremation? The answer was hiding inside the bone, and to find it, they had to do something no Stone Age archaeologist could have dreamed of. The skull was far too fragile to clean by hand, so the team did something clever. They didn't dig it out. They lifted the entire block of earth around it, soil, skull, and all as one solid piece. And they carried it into a laboratory. There, the conservator began the painstaking work of separating bone from sediment, fragment by fragment. And while she was working, she found it, a piece of wood, pine wood, sitting inside the skull's cavity. Now think about what that means. The first post, the one standing in front of the grave, was made of poplar wood. But this fragment inside the skull was pine, 2 different woods, which means 2 different posts. This was not one marker. This was a structure, an arrangement. But they still needed certainty. A splinter of wood inside a skull could be a coincidence, so they took the skull to a medical engineering institute, and they put it inside a high-powered CT scanner. The same kind of technology used to look inside the human body without cutting it open. and the scan removed all doubt. The wooden post had been driven up through the base of the skull, through the exact opening where the spinal cord once connected to the brain. Anatomists call it the foramen magnum, the great opening. The post had gone in through that hole and been pushed all the way up until it jammed against the inside top of the skull. This was not an accident of nature. This was deliberate, precise, almost surgical. The aurochs' skull had been mounted on a stake, standing upright, at the edge of the water, facing a human grave for who knows how long until the post finally rotted, snapped, and the great skull tumbled down into the mud where the peat caught it and kept it for 10,500 years. And the moment that scan results came back, one quiet, chilling thought spread through the research team. They had seen this exact thing once before. Not here, not in Germany, but somewhere else far to the north, a skull on a stake, pierced through that very same opening had once been pulled out of the bottom of a lake. And at the time, nobody could make sense of it. It was so strange, so isolated, that the world simply filed it away as a one-off horror, a freak of the ancient past, and moved on. But the German skull just changed that, because the moment you have two, it is no longer a freak. It is a pattern. And those other skulls, the ones everyone had quietly set aside, were not animals. To understand why the German find sent a shiver through archaeology, I have to take you across the sea now to Sweden, to a site whose name has quietly haunted researchers ever since they first uncovered it and never fully explained. Canneljorden. Ahead of a new railway, archaeologists were digging in an old, drained wetland. And at the bottom of what was once a small lake, they uncovered a platform. A flat surface, 12 meters by 14, built entirely out of large stones and deliberately laid down on the lake bed itself. Underwater. People had waded into a lake and built a stone floor beneath the surface. On purpose. And on that sunken platform they had placed the dead. The remains of at least 10 people, 9 adults and 1 tiny infant who may never have drawn a single breath. And scattered among them 400 wooden stakes. But it was 2 of the human skulls that turned this from a burial into a mystery that still has no clean answer. Because inside 2 of those skulls, archaeologists found wooden stakes still in place, driven up through the foramen magnum the exact same way as the aurochs in Germany thousands of years later. One of those stakes was measured, 47 centimeters long, sharpened to a point at one end, 20 centimeters of it still buried inside the skull when they lifted it from the peat. These human heads had been mounted and displayed. And now the details start to get genuinely strange, so pay attention because this is where the easy answers fall apart. The first thing the scientists noticed was what was missing, the jawbones. Almost none of the human skulls had their lower jaws. Now, a jawbone is heavy and tough. Water does not just float it away. So why were they gone? The answer the researchers reached is quietly haunting. These skulls were not fresh. The flesh had already decomposed somewhere else long enough for the jaw to naturally fall away before they were ever brought to this lake. In other words, these people had been dead for a long time and then someone went back, collected their skulls, and mounted them. But on at least one skull, that explanation breaks. Because inside one of the craniums, they found preserved brain tissue, still there, after 8,000 years. And brain tissue only survives if the head reaches the bog while it is still fleshed, still fresh. So which is it? Old, clean skulls or freshly severed heads? The same site seems to contain both, and nobody can fully explain that. Then there's the part that changed everything, the injuries. When the bones were examined, 7 of the 9 adults showed clear head wounds. Heavy, blunt force blows to the skull. But here is the twist that demolishes the obvious theory. The wounds had healed. These were not killing blows. These were old injuries. Survived. Years before death, in some cases. Which means these were not enemies struck down in battle and beheaded as trophies. As one of the lead researchers put it, somebody gave these people love and care and healed them back to life. And then the pattern inside, the wounds turned even colder. The injuries were different depending on whether the skull belonged to a man or a woman. The women had been struck on the back of the head, the men on the top or the front. 2 completely different patterns of violence inside one single group of people. And to this day, no one has a confident explanation for why. And then there is the strangest detail of all, the one that ties Sweden and Germany together into a single unsolved thread. On that Swedish platform there were animal bones too, at least 14 animals, wild boar, brown bear, red deer, badger. But here is the inversion that makes your skin prickle. From the animals, they kept mostly the jaws. From the humans, they kept the skulls. It is as if these 2 things, human and animal, were being deliberately mirrored. 2 halves of one idea we have completely lost. And now look at Germany. There it is, reversed again. The human is the cremation, the body. And the animal, the aurochs, is the mounted skull, the watching head. Human skulls on stakes by the water in one place, an animal skull on a stake by the water in another, separated by 2,500 years and hundreds of miles, connected by the same exact technique through the same exact hole in the skull at the same exact kind of place. The water's edge. This is not a coincidence anymore. This is a tradition, a belief system, a way of seeing death that stretched across a continent and across thousands of years and then vanished so completely that we never even knew it existed. And we only know it now because of that single aurochs skull lifted from a German bog and slid into a scanner just months ago. One fresh discovery reaching back across 8,000 years to finally explain the one in the Swedish lake that no one could ever crack. So let me bring you back to the question I asked at the very beginning. Why would these people mount skulls on stakes at the edge of the water? For years, the assumption was simple. Trophies, severed heads of beaten enemies, stuck on poles as a warning. It is the explanation we reach for instinctively because it is the one we recognize from our own history, but the evidence refuses to fit. The healed wounds, the careful cremation, the unbutchered, intact aurochs skull treated like something sacred. None of that is the behavior of warriors displaying the dead they hated. The German researchers believe the answer lies somewhere we rarely look. They think these skulls were a form of protection for the dead, that these people saw the world as deeply alive, that animals like the great aurochs carried spirit and power, and that mounting that animal's head beside a grave was a way of guarding the soul of the person buried there, a spiritual kinship between humans and the wild. And the Swedish skulls may be the same impulse, not enemies on pikes, but ancestors, honored, collected, raised up on stakes perhaps to keep watching over the living or to be watched over in the still water. But I want to be honest with you because you deserve the truth and not a neat ending. The scientists do not agree. Some say protection, some say ancestor worship. Some quietly wonder if these were people the group feared or marked or set apart. The real answer is that there is no close parallel anywhere on Earth to fully explain what these people believed. What we know for certain is this. 10,000 years ago at the edge of the water, our ancestors performed something solemn and deliberate with the skulls of the dead and the heads of the wild. And the wooden stakes that prove it should have rotted away to nothing, taking the secret with them forever. It was only the silence of the bog that kept the evidence alive long enough for us to find it. And it makes you wonder how many other beliefs, how many other rituals have already dissolved into the ground and left us with nothing at all. The dead in that lake are still keeping most of their secret. We have only just learned how to ask the question. If your mind is still turning this over, tell me what you think those skulls were truly for. Trophies, ancestors, or something we do not yet have a word for. Leave your theory below. And if you want to keep standing at the edge of these forgotten worlds, there is always another discovery waiting just beneath the surface.